Hello and welcome to this edition of Eurofound Talks. Today we're going to be talking about climate change. Climate change is still very much on the agenda, even though that may not be entirely clear from everything that's going on in the world right now. But we are discussing whether Europeans are actually effectively prepared for the kind of climate change that is occurring. We have recently published a report from both Eurofound and the European Environment Agency, one of our sister agencies, where it outlines the very serious situation that we are facing. 4 out of 5 Europeans have already felt the impact of extreme weather from either scorching heat waves or devastating wildfires. We know that they understand that this is what is occurring, but there seems to be a huge gap between these risks and our feeling or our ability to be able to cope with them. At the micro level, we have a European Union that is committed still to net zero by 2050. We want to see a 55% reduction in emissions by 2030. And at the same time, we have individuals saying that nearly 40% of them report that they are actually unable to afford to keep their homes cool. This is despite all of the efforts by EU institutions and member states to strengthen resilience and reduce vulnerability to the climate change element. But today we're diving into climate-related results, specifically from one survey that Eurofound hosts on an annual basis. That's called the Living and Working in Europe e-survey. It takes the temperature, if you like, of what European citizens are experiencing across the member states. And we're going to explore the gap between the EU ambitions on resilience and the reality of what that means for preparing households for the climate risks across Europe. We're also going to, I hope, discuss what policymakers can do to ensure that this is a socially fair transition. So I'm delighted today that we are joined actually by one of our colleagues from the EEA, Aleksandra Kazmierczak. You're very welcome, Aleksandra.
Hello, great to be here.
And from Eurofound, we have Marianna Baggio. You're very welcome, Marianna.
Thank you very much, Mary.
So, Marianna, I want to start with you. This report that we're talking about, it comes from this Living and Working in the EU survey. How was this data collected this year, and how representative is this survey, if you like, of the average European household?
So the e-survey is one of the surveys, as you said rightly, that we run every year. And you recently had Esther as well talking about the findings about financial resilience and trust that were coming from the exact same survey we ran. And in that survey, we have every year a little module that changes and looks into something that we are interested as researchers and that we know that policymakers as well are very interested in. That little module this year was done in collaboration with the EEA, and we together really thought about what can we ask Europeans about climate change, about preparedness, about their behavioral actions, what do they do, what they can't do, where do they struggle. So the idea was to collaborate together. And as you know, and maybe the listeners also know, that the e-survey is collected around all 27 EU member states. This year we collected 27,000 responses. We have a group of respondents that is our panel. So the year to year, they keep on responding, which is great for us to look at trends. And then we have new people that we recruit through social media advertising. Because it is an online survey, it doesn't perfectly mirror what's the European population. However, as researchers, we have a way of fixing this by using some statistical adjustments that reflect better the picture of Europe as a whole. And we fix this by ages, gender, education level, and regions. So it's like taking a picture of Europe and you realize that the colors are not just quite right, and you go and adjust them a little bit. So at the end of the day, the picture is a good picture. It tells you about what's happening. As you said, it measures the temperature. It shows what's what's out there and you can really reflect on it. However, we always say very clear in our report that you shouldn't take those absolute numbers as, setting stone, but it's really about giving us trends. It's about showcasing where the struggles are. It's telling policymakers, look at this, and this, and pay attention to what is happening.
Yeah, but I mean, to be clear as well, that when we have looked at the results from the e-survey, even though it is a very different survey from our other more robust, methodologically sound surveys, if you like the working conditions survey and the quality of life survey, the results that we find from the e-survey do map very nicely on to the results from those other surveys.
Yeah, absolutely. And in our report, readers will see that we check from these other surveys that are available where we are placed, and then we add on top of these some mechanism, more information. So it's really building on top of what's already available as well. It's absolutely a good tool.
And what's interesting is that from our working conditions survey, and we just had the results from our most recent European working conditions survey in 2024 that we carried out, and the results have been coming through over the last little while. We know that there has been an increase in reporting on high levels of heat for those who are working. So here, I suppose what we're looking at is heat in terms of how it affects the citizen, the non-working citizen, if you like, or the citizen when they're not working. And can you tell us a little bit about what this survey tells us about how people are experiencing high temperatures in their daily lives, particularly when we're talking about homes versus what they would experience in the workplace?
So the result of this survey was really striking in the sense that 1 out of 2 really feels hot at home. And the heat was really something that was felt also outside the house, like in your neighborhood. And this was even higher than the house, so like 60%. So people are
60% of people are feeling that they are too hot in their house.
And outside the house, it's like around half in the house. And then when they go into their neighborhood, it's just slightly higher. So they are hot at home. When they go out, they feel the heat. And this is quite strong. I think overall, you said it at the beginning, people experience climate change impacts at 80% of the people has felt something. Was it the flood? Was it the wildfires? In Ireland, 43% felt the impact of wind, and us being in Ireland, we can feel that very much. But I think the heat...
We can feel the wind, perhaps, Marianna, but we're certainly not feeling the heat.
No, we're not feeling the heat. But overall in Europe, that was the most felt. And I think 1 out of 2 that at home feel too hot, it's quite striking. And I think it's also important to highlight that peoples in the cities were feeling it much more than peoples in the countryside, because you have this cement block kind of heat, but really feeling hot was what was striking. I think feeling hot at home, it's something really uncomfortable. And it was, more than what people felt at work, because maybe at work you have air conditioning, that it's a shared infrastructure, while at home it's, up to you to make sure that you don't feel that warmth and that heat, and that's a struggle.
Certainly that is. I mean, Aleksandra, maybe we can look at that a little bit more, because I saw in the results that it also says that 1 in 5 say that there are no resilience measures at home. I mean, that's kind of what we would say is measures in place to offset the kind of thing that Marianna is talking about here. Why is the uptake of these sort of things like insulation or floodproofing, why is it so low?
Well, what we found through the survey is that the uptake of different resilience measures really differed. So actually, things like roof and wall insulation or shading were amongst the most frequently applied ones by the respondents. About just under half of the respondents had them. So we can take either the optimistic view that it's nearly half of the respondents who have them at home, or a slightly more negative view that half of them didn't have it. Let's remember that not all houses would need insulation or shading. So, for example, the traditionally built houses in the southern Europe with very thick walls, they might be able to actually withstand the heat and protect people inside from high temperatures. Also, if you live in a flat that has north and east facing windows, you do not necessarily need shading. And if you don't live in a flood risk area, you might not need flood protection. So sometimes it's actually the location of the house that might dictate whether resilience measures are needed. However, what I found slightly concerning is that only about 40% of the respondents had in place insurance that would protect them against extreme weather, which means that 6 out of 10 of our respondents would be exposed to high levels of losses if extreme weather events such as flooding or wildfire or wind, like you mentioned in Ireland, actually happened.
But Aleksandra, would that also be not necessarily always because someone can't afford to take insurance for these measures? It's also because the insurance companies don't offer them that kind of coverage.
It might be the case. We have a variety of different insurance systems in Europe. Some are more market-based, so to speak. Some are more solidarity-based. So it really depends on the country, but it might be indeed that even in some high flood risk areas, the housing insurance is not available or it's not affordable because the insurance premiums are so high that people are actually priced out of the system that is supposed to protect them.
Yeah. And that will probably be increasingly the case as insurance companies realize this kind of threat that we are experiencing. I mean, it also looks, I suppose, very much at this affordability crisis. And we're already looking at a cost of living crisis. Now, with the current wars across the globe, we're looking at heating crises because of the oil prices. But I suppose also similarly, we'll be looking at a crisis in terms of trying to keep houses cool. And I see that in terms of the results, there's nearly 40% of respondents say that they can't afford to keep their homes cool. And Marianna says that, that's increasingly a problem. There's this affordability aspect. We're already in this sort of, socioeconomic crisis, if you like, of inequalities. How does this change the way a family experiences a heat wave?
I must say that I found this number, this 38% of people not being able to afford keeping their home comfortably cool. I found it absolutely shocking, especially comparing against previous surveys that were done and were asking similar types of questions about the ability to keep cool or ability to afford the cooling, which was usually oscillating around 19-20% of the European population. Of course, Marianna mentioned all the issues about the survey not necessarily being fully representative of the population, but I think that two factors indeed have been in play here. Firstly, the increasing heat waves and hot periods across Europe that necessitate the need of cooling. But secondly, like you mentioned, the energy crisis and the prices going up as a result of the Russian war of aggression on Ukraine, for example. But
and the most recent war in Iran.
Yes, although our survey didn't capture that, of course, because it was run
but we
last
can understand
year.
that it has been exacerbated by that further.
Yes. And the even more shocking finding was that for the respondents who were struggling the most financially, even 2/3 of them were not able to afford keeping their home cool. So we see a sort of huge disparity between the wealthier and the poorer respondents that very clearly links to the affordability of measures. So there is plenty of evidence that suggests that people who are in the worse income situation, that are coming from a sort of lower socioeconomic groups, might be experiencing heat waves in different ways. And Marianna already mentioned this issue that, people might be hot at home because they might be living in poor quality housing that overheats, but they actually live in a very dense urban environment that is also very hot. The same groups might be working in low income jobs, in kitchens, as delivery drivers, as bus drivers, and they are constantly exposed to heat, which means that they might not get the respite at work, at home, or actually traveling to
It's
work by public
relentless.
transport.
No,
It's relentless.
and that's kind of frightening. I mean, well, more than frightening.
And if I just may add to that if you add the level of sort of personal vulnerability as well, if you are in poor health and on low income, or if you are an elderly person and on low income and you cannot afford any protective measures, then your exposure to heat might mean that you actually get a heat stroke, or that your heart disease or kidney disease gets worse. And what we see is that the most frequent victims of heat are people over 75, or those indeed that have cardiovascular diseases or other pre-existing health conditions.
And I assume very young people also. I mean, babies exposed to that kind of level of heat would also be very vulnerable.
Yes, babies and children and even adolescents. Actually, there is some very interesting research from Czechia about hospital admissions or the sort of the emergency visits of people during heat waves. And it points out at a very high share of young people being admitted as well. So indeed, it's not a problem for just the elderly. It's a society-wide problem.
I'm very interested in this divide, because it would seem from what Marianna was saying earlier is that there's a heat divide, a sort of a rural-urban heat divide. And now you're also talking about, this divide when it comes to vulnerability as well in terms of health issues. Also, I suppose there's a divide between Southern, Eastern and Northern Europe. Clearly, when we were talking earlier, Marianna and I wouldn't have the same experience of this heat as other countries do. Are we going to look at sort of another regional divide across Europe when it comes through this?
Definitely. And Southern Europe is really a hotspot, forgive the pun, when it comes to climate change impacts. This is where the most intense and longest and most frequent heat waves happen. This is the hotspot for wildfires. That's where the issues related to water scarcity are concentrated. And for example, the event of flooding in the Valencia region also shows that this region is not immune to flooding. So it's really facing a lot of the impacts, and all the climate projections and the climate science is pointing out to the fact that it will only get worse and much worse than in other regions of the Europe. It's really reflected in the findings of our report, because it was the respondents from Southern Europe that were the most frequently reporting being impacted by various climatic events. Also, they usually had a lower level of preparedness, so the lower proportion of the respondents were reporting that they had certain measures at home, with the exception of air conditioning and shading. So that was higher compared to other regions. At the same time, Northern Europe emerges as the least impacted and also not very well prepared. But if they are not impacted, then maybe they don't need to be so much prepared, or maybe they're not expecting that to be so bad in the future.
Although, Aleksandra, just to interrupt you for 2 seconds there, I mean, they're perhaps not impacted by heat, but I presume they're impacted by other climate-related weather changes.
Yes, indeed. So, for example, in the case of flooding, we could see a higher number there. And you already mentioned Ireland and the problems with winds. So it really depends on the climatic zone in Europe, what the respondents were feeling the most. One finding that I found very interesting was that respondents from Central and Eastern Europe were reporting more frequently actually having the preparedness measures at home. And the reason why I found it interesting is that traditionally, and I'm coming from the adaptation to climate change side of things, traditionally Eastern Europe was a sort of the least prepared region, so to speak. So it's really interesting to see that the findings contradict this preconception slightly, and we can see that both the individual preparedness but also the preparedness by local authorities as perceived by the respondents is actually higher for many measures than in other regions.
Yeah. I suppose, I mean, Marianna, we have been talking about the impact that it has disproportionately on those who have kind of vulnerabilities in health. The report is also talking about renters, those who are renting their accommodation, that they might be hit harder. Why is that the case?
Well, I think that there is a mismatch in the incentives when it comes to renter versus owners, because we compare the renters to the owners. And I'm a renter and I can't hang a picture on the wall. Needless to speak, that I can't really make big changes like making a air conditioning system in my home. And despite that limit of what can I do to a home that I'm renting, there is also the fact that I can't really invest that much on a home that I rent, with the risk of being moved, evicted, or the owner wanting the home back for himself. So, and the owner at the same time doesn't really have an incentive to improve my home in this sense, because he's not living in there. It's going to cost him money, him or her money, and it's just the incentives are not placed well for renters. So renters are forced quite often into a living situation that is not up to standard in terms of measures to protect from climate change, especially heat. And I think there is also, I mean, with the housing crisis, the risk of renovictions, and I'm sure you've heard of it, the fact that maybe the owner wants to renovate and evicts the person and then puts the house back into a higher price. It's simply because also people want to live in homes that are better insulated, that are more energy efficient, and that allow you to have a better quality of life in that home. So I think for renters, this is a really, really difficult spot because of this mismatch of incentives. And
But Marianna, would it not be also, incumbent on policymakers to ensure that there is a baseline level of measures that are implemented across the board, so that you can't rent that kind of accommodation without that facility being available?
I think this is absolutely true. And for some member states, you can see that this is the direction where it's been going. For example, in Belgium, you cannot have a hike in your rental prices if your home is not built up to standards in terms of energy efficiency. So I think we are more and more realizing that we have to protect renters in this sense, and we have to bring everybody up to the same speed. In our research, we also found a slight difference between those renters that were, in the private market or that were renting from the public space in terms of housing. That's for when you rent from the public, your housing is at a better quality. So in terms of the public sector has higher standards than the private sector in terms of energy efficiency and protecting the renters as well. But absolutely, tenants have a worse overall situation than owners.
And when we talk about those who have poor health, we talked about it briefly already. I mean, again, is it that they have less agency because of their vulnerabilities, or is it because there is a general lack of resources?
It's a mix of both. When you have health issues, you might have also problems regarding your income situation. You might need to work less, so maybe you have a disability, you're working, you can't work, so you have less availability to invest in these solutions to improve your housing situation in terms of resilience. But I also think that it's quite demanding to have poor health in terms of your cognitive availability to handle so many issues. And when you have poor health,
multiple vulnerabilities, in fact,
you have to deal with your health and also thinking about climate change and adapting and everything. It's quite overwhelming, and it's understandable that these people don't have also the ability to look after that portion of their lives. And I think here the public policy should look into that and have a hand to help these people who are really compounding their vulnerabilities, which is quite unfair.
I mean, to move on to that a little bit, Aleksandra, just in terms of the understanding or the awareness of those, not only those who have health issues, but all citizens. I mean, what kind of level of awareness is there about information campaigns, about, what to put in place, how to offset climate change issues? How are we seeing the information campaigns working? Are they actually contributing to making people more aware, taking action either at policy level or indeed at the individual level?
I think that then awareness campaigns and then extreme weather warnings and alerts are absolutely key for the protection of the population. We have seen in terms of the early warnings how they actually reduce fatalities associated with flooding. So looking at the example of my home country, Poland, it was hit by flooding in September 2024, and only 9 people lost their lives. When we compare it to 1997, it was 55 people or 56 who died, even though the flooding extent was smaller. And one of the things that this huge improvement is attributed to is the awareness of the population and the effective warnings in place.
Yeah.
So it's an absolute key
Critical
mechanism
element,
for protection of the population. Having said that, just issuing a warning without saying what should be done and without giving people the agency or the ability to
It's
act
not enough.
is not enough. It won't do much. We can also debate whether sort of issuing more warnings is actually better, or whether it leads to the population being desensitized. What we found
But
for the
information with action measures, the two
Yes.
together. Yeah.
Yes, but what we see, for example, in the case of heat warnings, in the case of heat warnings, very often, well, the large proportion of the population really enjoys warm weather. And hearing every time when the temperature hits 25 or 27 or 30 degrees that it's dangerous, it's almost feels like crying wolf to many, that, hey, but I'm fine. Even though if the epidemiological studies are showing that these temperatures are dangerous for many people in the population, if people hear the same warning over and over, they just stop listening. It's like, at the Copenhagen airport, in one of the terminals, there's a fire alarm that goes off every 15 minutes. No one cares. No one listens anymore. No one reacts. So it's sort of a very fine balancing act between keeping the population aware and informed, and between actually tiring people out and making them to, stop listening with too much warnings, too many warnings, or too much information.
But that actually resonates with the bigger picture of the communication campaign on climate change, generally speaking, is that 5 minutes to midnight warning just doesn't ring true with people any longer because they've heard it for too long. So it is a question of how do you communicate better to ensure that people actually do take action. And Marianna, I'm interested in that perspective with respect to the different generations, because you talked earlier about the older generation being more vulnerable, and Aleksandra was indicating that. And of course, there are some, the very young also are equally vulnerable. But the young respondents in this survey indicated some of the highest levels of concern about climate change. What do you think that tells us about the differences in the understanding either of the information or how we consume it across the generations?
Well, I think at the bottom line of this issue is that we have very different time frames ahead of us when it comes to generations. So the youngest generations are the ones that are going to see climate change really unfolding into the ways that we actually hope it doesn't, but it might, and they're gonna really have the big effects for the whole of their life. So their perspective it's much longer than somebody who's older might still be worried, but the worry is relatively short term to deal with what is happening now and adapting. And in our survey, we've seen that 75 and up were the most prepared at home. Maybe a little bit because the online survey, we had a very specific group of people, but they are homeowners. They had a lifetime to build their savings that they can invest in these measures, while the young people are also facing compounded challenges for themselves also in the terms of housing, being unable even to move out of the house, being struggling to find a place where to live, and that having to deal also with climate change, which feels quite often like an unfair inheritance from previous generations. They are very worried, and rightly so.
And rightly so, yeah. I mean, there is no doubt that this report gives us an awful lot of food for thought, not just about the particular issue of overheating, but on the impact of climate change more generally. But from both of your perspectives, the two of you, at the end of these podcasts, we tend to say, if you were to meet one policymaker who could make a difference to these particular issues, and you were to travel up the elevator with them, what would be the three main points that you would put on the table to them? So perhaps we could start with you, Marianna, if you were to talk to me in three.
So I would say help renters, not just homeowners. We really look into the issues around renters, and we need to get financial help. We need to get grants and loans to allow both tenants and homeowners to invest in these rented properties so that renters can live better and live in a house that is prepared without the prices skyrocketing or forcing people out of their living situation. Then we need to make cooling affordable for everyone, because we've seen that those who struggle the most to keep cool are the ones that are financially struggling as well. So finding solutions to keep everybody cool during these extreme heat waves, it's very important. And then update building rules, because we need to change the construction laws so that preparedness is embedded in how we build from the very start, and it's status quo. It's not something that we add on anymore.
Okay, thank you. Aleksandra, do you have something to add as you climb to the 6th floor?
Well, it's hard to find some additional things, but to expand on what Marianna was saying, those issue of grants and subsidies, very often we see grants being offered for wall insulation or roof insulation or rainwater collection, but often they require a substantial upfront investment from the person receiving the grant, and therefore it immediately filters out the groups that are on lower incomes or that do not have, savings that would allow them to invest. So offering some sort of more progressive grants and subsidies that would differentiate between the different income levels and give the sort of more equal playing field for people wanting to invest in resilience measures. I also would like to come back to the issue of awareness, because actually one of the main things that people can do to keep cool at home often very simple. And for example, the World Health Organization Regional Office for Europe has been running this campaign, Keep Cool campaign, for a few years now, advising people on doing very simple things like, draw the curtains or do not go out shopping at midday. So really investing into those awareness raising that is not just scaring people that extreme weather happens, but gives them very practical tools what could be done. And finally, whilst of course this survey was focused on the individual households and individual respondents, in order to achieve climate resilience, we cannot just rely on actions by the individuals. We need substantial investment into collective measures, into effective spatial planning that doesn't build more houses in floodplains, into urban greening that allows our cities to be cool and deal with the extreme rainfall that falls, and doing those things by public authorities and not just necessarily relying on the actions being taken by the individuals.
Well, I think that's a very good place to close this current podcast, is that collective action is required. It cannot always be just down to the individual. Information campaigns need to be segmented and targeted, but also action oriented. And I think also to look very much at these growing divides, both regional, generational perhaps, and urban and rural, is a very important element to ensure that we don't think that one size fits all when we're dealing with this particular issue. I would like to thank you both very much. That's an absolutely fascinating insight into the work of the e-survey, and that's only one element of the e-survey. As we know, we've already talked about the cost of living crisis, which was also part of that e-survey. But I would like to thank our colleagues in the EEA for the ongoing collaboration that we have with them on so many aspects, and this in particular. Please do access the overall report, which is Overheated and Underprepared Europeans' Experience of Living with Climate Change, which is online and available freely on our website. I would also suggest that you listen back to some of the previous episodes that we have on this particular topic, What Future for Green Jobs in Europe, and the joint webinar that we had with the EEA also, Is Europe's Green Transition in Jeopardy? This is all part of the information campaign that we are trying to contribute to raise awareness across the European Union to citizens, to workers, as to how climate change is affecting their lives and the policies that are being put in place. For those of you who are following us regularly on Eurofound Talks, thank you very much. For those of you who are listening to us for the first time, you can download other Eurofound Talks on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or indeed wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us, both the EEA and Eurofound, on social media channels. And we look forward to contributing to the conversation on an ongoing basis into the future. Please feel free to contact us with any queries or questions you may have this or in any of the relevant topics that we've discussed today. Thank you again, and until next time when Eurofound talks to you.